I was standing backstage, wiping my hands on my apron, the good one, the starched white one I only wore for special occasions. The fabric was stiff, smelling faintly of lemon and hot wax from the iron. Through the heavy velvet curtain, I could hear the murmur of the crowd, the clinking of glasses. My heart, it wasn't just beating, it was thumping a rhythm against my ribs, a proud, happy drum roll. Our restaurant, our Laura's Kitchen, was getting an award. 20 years of early mornings, of burnt knuckles and aching feet, of peeling potatoes until my fingers were raw. And for what? For this exact moment. My son, Martin, walked onto the stage. He looked so handsome in his suit, the one I'd helped him pick out. He looked like his father. He tapped the microphone, a sound that echoed a little too loudly, and the room fell quiet. I peeked through the slit in the curtain. I could see the faces in the front row, all the important people, the critics, the other chefs. I saw Mr. Blackwood, the man whose review had started all of this. Martin cleared his throat. "We are so honored," he began. His voice was smooth, confident. "To build something that lasts, you have to look to the future." He smiled, that easy, charming smile of his. "And so, tonight, we are thrilled to introduce the future of our kitchen." My own smile froze on my face. The future? I was the kitchen. My hands were in every sauce, my memory in every recipe. A knot of confusion tightened in my stomach. "Please welcome our new creative vision, our new brand chef," Martin announced, his voice booming. And then a young man walked out from the other side of the stage. He couldn't have been more than 30. He had slicked back hair, tattoos crawling up his forearms from under the cuffs of a ridiculously tight gray chef's coat. The crowd erupted in applause. They were clapping for a stranger, for a boy who probably thought my bechamel sauce was some kind of quaint, old-fashioned gravy. I felt the air leave my lungs. I must have misunderstood. This was a consultant, perhaps? A new sous chef? Martin wouldn't just... Then my son turned, and his eyes found mine through the gap in the curtain. For a second, just a flicker, I saw something. Shame? No, it was gone too quickly. He gave a polished, public smile. "And of course," he said into the microphone, his voice dripping with false sentiment, "we have to thank my mother for her long years of service." Service. The word hit me like a physical blow. Not creation, not passion, not legacy. Service. The word you use for a maid, for a groundskeeper, for someone you pay to perform a task. My daughter-in-law, Sophie, glided towards me from the wings. She was holding a massive bouquet of long-stemmed red roses, wrapped in crackling cellophane. She looked perfect, of course. Her dress was silver and sleek. Her smile was sharp and bright. She pushed the flowers into my arms. They were heavy, cold, and the thorns pricked my fingers through the paper. "Smile, Mom," she whispered, her voice a little too sweet. "The cameras are on you." And I did. I smiled. I looked out at the blur of faces and flashing lights, and I nodded. The applause was a distant roaring in my ears, like the sound of the ocean trying to drag you under. I took the flowers. I smiled, and I nodded. Because that's what you do. You don't make a scene. You don't show them the crack that just splintered right through the center of your heart. It wasn't just a bouquet. It was a gold watch. It was a severance package. It was a public execution of my life's work, gift wrapped in roses and polite applause. They stood on stage, the three of them, my son, his ambitious wife, and the tattooed future of my kitchen soaking in the light. They thought it was over. They thought they had handled it perfectly. A tribute, a gentle, respectful pushing aside of the old guard. They thought I was just the cook, a sweet old lady in an apron who would now retire gracefully to her garden. They forgot. In all their planning, in all their clever marketing and brand refreshing, they forgot the most important thing. They forgot that 20 years ago, when I signed the lease for a derelict little storefront with nothing but my grandmother's recipes and a loan I wasn't sure I could ever repay, I filled out another piece of paper, a simple form. I registered the business name. And on that line, in my own handwriting, it said, Laura's Kitchen. They thought they owned the restaurant. They forgot that I owned its name. The ceremony bled into a reception. A loud, crowded room full of people sipping champagne and eating tiny, complicated things on crackers that I would never have allowed to leave my kitchen. Food without soul. I found a corner, near a tall fern that was shedding on the carpet. I was still holding that ridiculous bouquet. The cellophane crackled every time I moved. I felt like a ghost at my own wake. I watched them. Martin was holding court, laughing, shaking hands. He never once looked my way. He was free. He was no longer Laura's son, the boy who inherited the kitchen. He was the visionary, the restaurateur. Sophie was by his side, her hand possessively on his arm, steering him from one important conversation to another. She was the architect of this. I could see her strategy in every detail, the timing, the public stage, the flowers. It was brilliant, in a cold, bloodless sort of way. Turn a firing into a tribute, and no one can call you a villain. People's eyes would drift over to me, standing alone in my corner, and then quickly dart away. They didn't know what to say. Was I the guest of honor, or a relic on display? The coldness of the room was more than just the air conditioning. It was the chilling realization that my life's work had just been declared a museum piece. Then, through the crowd, I saw Julian, my sommelier. He'd been with me since the beginning. A tall, elegant man with silver hair and eyes that had seen everything. I taught him how to pair wine not with fish or meat, but with a person's mood. He was supposed to be out there, schmoozing, making sure the right people were drinking the right vintage. Instead, he walked straight past Martin and Sophie, who tried to flag him down. He didn't even glance at them. He walked directly to my corner. He didn't say a word. He looked at the garish bouquet in my arms, then up at my face. His own was a mask of quiet fury and profound sadness. He gently took my right hand, the one not clutching the roses, and he bowed his head and kissed my knuckles. It was an old-world gesture, a gesture of fealty, of respect, a gesture that said, I am with you. You are still the queen. When he looked up, his eyes were wet. Laura, he whispered, his voice thick, and that was all he needed to say. It was like he broke a spell. After him came Maria, who runs the pantry, a small, round woman who smells of dried herbs and sugar. She came over and just squeezed my arm, her work-roughened hand a comforting weight. We love you, chef, she murmured, before melting back into the crowd. Then came Carlos, my head dishwasher, a giant of a man who could be intimidating to anyone who didn't know his gentle heart. He just gave me a solemn nod, a nod that said more than 1,000 empty speeches. One by one, they came, the old guard, my people, the ones who knew the restaurant wasn't the fancy new decor or the name on an award. It was the sound of my knife on the cutting board, the smell of garlic hitting hot olive oil, the quiet rhythm of a team that worked not for a brand, but for a person. They formed a silent, invisible line to my corner, each one offering a quiet gesture of loyalty that was louder than all the applause. They were building a fortress around me, brick by silent brick. The last person to approach was Mr. Blackwood, the critic. He was a formidable man, not because he was large, but because he was so still. He observed everything. He navigated the room and stood before me, his expression unreadable. Laura, he said, his voice low and direct. That was quite a performance. I managed a small, tired smile. They do love their theater. He looked over at the triumphant trio posing for yet another photo with the new chef. Indeed, he paused. Then his eyes met mine, and they were sharp, intelligent, and deeply serious. I wrote about this place because of your cooking, because of the heart in it. I hope, for the sake of this city, that this is not the last time we will taste your food. He let the words hang in the air for a moment. Because, if it is, that would be a crime. He gave a slight, formal bow of his head and walked away. And that was it. That was the moment the ice in my veins, the shock that had frozen me solid, finally began to melt. But it didn't melt into tears. It melted into fire. The pain was still there, a deep, aching wound where my pride used to be. The humiliation was still there, a bitter taste in my mouth, but something new was there now, too. A cold, hard certainty. I wasn't just a cook they had betrayed. I was a leader they had abandoned. And my army, my quiet, loyal army, was standing right behind me. They weren't just showing me sympathy. They were waiting for orders. I looked down at the roses clutched in my hand. Their stems were sweating against my palm, beautiful, thorny, and already starting to wilt under the hot lights of the party, a symbol of a legacy they were trying to kill. I looked over at my son, my boy. He was laughing, raising a glass of champagne. He looked happy. He looked free. And in that moment, the love I had for him, the deep, primal love of a mother, was overshadowed by a terrible, clear-eyed pity. He had no idea what he had just done. He and his clever wife thought they had just won the future. They had no idea they had just declared war on the past, and the past was about to fight back. I straightened my shoulders. I took a deep breath. The air still smelled of their victory, of expensive perfume and soulless food. But underneath it all, I could still smell the faint, familiar scent of lemon and wax on my apron, the smell of my kitchen. My kitchen. This wasn't an ending. It was a beginning. They wanted the restaurant. They could have the building. They could have the new chairs, the fancy menus, the tattooed chef. But the name on the sign, the name on the award, the name that Mr. Blackwood wrote in the paper, that was mine. And it had with cotton. I didn't sleep that night. Or maybe I did. In short, ragged bursts that felt more like falling than resting. I kept seeing that stage, the bright lights, the smug look on Sophie's face as she handed me those roses. In my dreams, the thorns grew into long, sharp needles, and the cellophane wrapping tightened around my chest until I couldn't breathe. When the sun finally came up, streaking the sky in shades of bruised purple and gray, I was already in my kitchen, my real kitchen, here at home. The worn butcher block island felt cool and solid under my palms. This was my sanctuary. This was where the truth lived. I threw the roses from the ceremony into the bin. They landed with a dull, heavy thud. I didn't even bother taking them out of the cellophane. Let them rot together. Then I made coffee, strong and black, the way I like it. As the bitter, familiar aroma filled the air, I sat down at my table with my old, dog-eared address book and picked up the phone. My hand was steady. There were no tears. The time for tears was over. This was the time for action. My lawyer, Mr. Henderson, is a quiet, meticulous man. He's handled my affairs for 30 years, since before Martin was even born. He was surprised to hear from me at 7 in the morning. "Laura," he said, his voice a little gravelly with sleep. "Is everything all right?" "Everything is about to be, David," I said. I explained what had happened, keeping my voice even, reporting the facts as if I were describing a car accident I had witnessed. The award, the new chef, the bouquet, the words "years of service." He was silent for a long moment when I finished. I could hear the faint sound of him tapping a pen on his desk. "The ungrateful little," he started, then caught himself. "Laura, I am so sorry." "Don't be sorry, David. Be effective," I said. "Do you remember the paperwork we filed when I first opened the restaurant? The trademark registration for the name Laura's Kitchen?" I could almost hear the smile in his voice. "I remember it distinctly. You insisted on it. Said a name was the only thing you could truly own." "Well," I said, taking a sip of my hot black coffee, "it's time to collect on that ownership." I gave him his instructions. A formal letter, a cease and desist, immediate effect. He told me it would be on Martin's desk by 10 a.m. The call from my son came at 10:15. I was expecting it. I had just finished my second cup of coffee and was looking out the window at the old oak tree in my garden. "What is this?" he shouted, his voice tinny and distorted with rage through the phone's speaker. There was no greeting, no "Hello, Mom," just pure, undiluted fury. "Good morning to you too, Martin," I said calmly. "Don't good morning me. Henderson's office just sent over a letter. A legal threat. Are you insane? You're suing your own son." "I'm not suing you, Martin," I replied, my voice as level as I could make it. "I am simply instructing you to stop using my property. The name Laura's Kitchen is mine. It always has been." "Your property? It's the family business. You're trying to destroy it. Everything we've worked for." "We," the word hung in the air. "What we worked for, Martin," I said, the quiet intensity in my voice surprising even myself, "was a place with soul, a place where the food was honest and the people were respected. What you and Sophie did last night, that wasn't family, that wasn't respect, that was a corporate takeover, and you did it on a public stage." I could hear Sophie in the background, her sharp, urgent whispers. "Ask him about shared assets, goodwill, implied license." Martin's voice came back, laced with her legalese. "We have an implied license to use the name. You let us use it for years." "Yes, I did," I said. "I let my son use my name because I trusted him. I thought he understood what it meant. Last night, you showed me that you don't. The license, as you call it, is revoked." He was sputtering now, a mixture of rage and panic. He was like a child who had broken a precious vase and was now blaming the vase for being fragile. "This is because of that new chef, isn't it? You can't stand that we're trying to modernize, to move forward." "This isn't about modernizing, Martin. This is about decency. You could have talked to me. We could have worked something out. But you and your wife chose to humiliate me. You stood on a stage and thanked me for my service as if I were the hired help. You dismissed me. So, consider this my response." "You'll ruin us," he finally wailed, the anger giving way to a raw, terrified panic. "No, Martin," I said. And this was the hardest, truest thing I had ever had to say to him. "You are ruining yourselves. You just don't know it yet." I hung up the phone. I didn't slam it down. I placed it gently back in its cradle. It wasn't a happy feeling, the one that settled over me. It was not the sweet taste of revenge. It was the quiet, cold hum of a machine that has just been switched on. A machine that does what it was built to do. My next calls were to my people, Julian, Maria, Carlos, and the others. I kept it simple. "I'm having breakfast at the Corner Bistro tomorrow morning at 9, I said. "I'd love for you to join me, if you're free." The Corner Bistro is a small, unassuming place, right across the street from the restaurant. You can sit at a window table and see the front door, the big green awning with the gold lettering, my name. The next morning they were all there, crowded around 2 tables pushed together. They looked tired, anxious. They didn't know what was happening. They just knew something had broken. I let them order coffee and toast, and then I told them everything. I told them about the trademark, the lawyer's letter, the phone call with Martin, and then I told them my plan. "I'm going to open a new place," I said, my voice quiet but clear in the little cafe. "It won't be big or fancy. It'll be small. It'll be honest. A place where the food comes first, where the staff is family. I don't have a location yet, and I don't have a lot of money, but I have my recipes, and I have my name." I looked around the table, meeting each of their eyes. "I am not asking any of you to leave your jobs. You have families to support, bills to pay. I can't offer you security right now. All I can offer is a promise that if you ever want to cook real food with me again, my door will always be open for you." The relief in the room was a palpable thing. It was as if they had all been holding their breath, and now they could finally let it out. Julian, who had been listening with a grim, thoughtful expression, was the first to speak. He pushed his coffee cup aside and folded his hands on the table. He looked at me, a slow, determined smile spreading across his face. "Chef," he said, his voice resonating with a deep loyalty that humbled me. "You don't need to offer us security. You are our security. The question is not if we will join you. The question is, when do we start?" One by one, they all nodded. Maria was crying softly into her napkin. Carlos reached across the table and patted my hand, his huge, calloused palm covering mine completely. I sat there, looking at these faces, these people who had been the true heart of my kitchen for so many years, and I felt a warmth spread through my chest that had nothing to do with the coffee. They thought they had left me with nothing. They had left me with everything that mattered. After breakfast, we all stood outside the cafe for a moment. From here, we had a perfect view of the restaurant's entrance. My restaurant. I watched as Julian straightened his tie, squared his shoulders, and walked across the street. He looked like a general heading into battle. He opened the front door and disappeared inside. A few minutes later, he came out, unbuttoning his waistcoat. He walked back to us, a crisp white envelope in his hand. It was his notice. He didn't have to say a word. He handed it to Maria. She took it, went inside, and came back a few minutes later. She handed it to Carlos. One by one, my old guard, my family, walked across that street like soldiers, dignified and resolute. They went into that beautiful, soulless building, and they quit. I didn't go in myself. I just stood on that corner and watched. I imagined the scene inside. Martin and Sophie, their panic turning to sheer terror as the backbone of their restaurant calmly and quietly snapped, vertebra by vertebra. I pictured the stack of white envelopes growing on the gleaming, polished surface of the host stand. Each letter was a single sentence in a story he had refused to read. Each resignation was a testament to a simple truth. You can't buy loyalty. You earn it. They thought they had taken my kitchen. I was about to show them they'd only been left with the walls. The first week was a blur of sawdust, paint fumes, and the most soul-satisfying exhaustion I had felt in years. Finding the new place was a small miracle, a piece of luck I hadn't been expecting. It was an old bakery that had been closed for a decade, right across the street. The irony was so thick you could have sliced it. Mr. Chen, the landlord, was an old friend. He used to deliver my flour, back in the very beginning. When I called him, he didn't even ask for a business plan. He just said, "Laura, your word and your handshake are better than any bank loan. The keys are yours." The place was a mess, but it was an honest mess. It had good bones, high ceilings, a big picture window at the front that was clouded with years of city grime. The first thing we did, even before sweeping the floors, was wash that window. Julian, Carlos, Maria, and I, with buckets of soapy water and squeegees. As the grime sluiced away, the world outside came into sharp, painful focus. There it was, Laura's kitchen, or what was left of it. They had already taken my name down. A big, ugly scar of raw wood and empty bolt holes was left on the green awning. In its place, they had hung a temporary banner. It just said, "The Kitchen," generic, soulless. An anonymous name for an anonymous place. My crew, my family never said a word about it. They saw me looking, and they simply worked harder. Carlos, with his immense strength, tore out the rotten counters with a crowbar, the sound of splintering wood a strangely satisfying percussion. Julian, who I'd only ever seen handle a delicate wine glass, was on his hands and knees, meticulously sanding down the old wooden floors. Maria, my practical, wonderful Maria, had graph paper and a pencil, sketching out the most efficient layout for a tiny kitchen, her tongue sticking out of the corner of her mouth in concentration. There was laughter. That's what I remember most. We were covered in dust, our backs ached, but we were laughing. We were building something from nothing, together. We were fueled by coffee in paper cups and sandwiches from the deli down the block. We were a hive of activity, of purpose, and across the street, chaos. We didn't have to spy. The news came to us. Our suppliers would stop by, dropping off a case of olive oil or a bag of onions for our future pantry. "Laura," one of them said, shaking his head, "it's a disaster over there. The new guy sent back a whole crate of tomatoes. Said they weren't aesthetically uniform. You used to praise those tomatoes. He's trying to cook with a rule book, not his hands." Then the customers started coming. At first, it was just one or two poking their heads into our dusty storefront, their faces full of confusion. "Laura, is it true? What's going on?" I'd wipe my hands on my jeans and go talk to them. I kept it simple. "I've moved on," I'd say. "We're starting something new here, something small and good." By the end of the week, it was a pilgrimage. They came in a steady stream, my regulars, my people. Mr. and Mrs. Fitzgerald, who had been coming every Friday night for 15 years. They stood in the doorway, their old faces etched with concern. "We went last night," Mrs. Fitzgerald said, her voice a low, conspiratorial whisper. "We felt we had to, to see." "It was dreadful," her husband finished, his jowls quivering with indignation. "The girl who took our order didn't know the difference between a Pinot Noir and a Pinot Grigio. Julian would have had a heart attack. And the food, Laura, my lamb shank, it was cold in the middle. They put some kind of purple foam on it." He said the word foam, as if it were a mortal insult. "We won't be back," Mrs. Fitzgerald added, placing a frail, gloved hand on my arm. "We told them so. We told the young woman at the front that Sophie," we said, "this isn't Laura's kitchen anymore." And we left. She looked around at the beautiful mess of our new beginning, at the bare walls and the bags of cement. "You just tell us when you're open. We'll be your first customers." They were my town criers. They, and dozens like them, were spreading the word more effectively than any advertising campaign. They were voting with their feet, with their wallets, with their loyalty. One night, late, I stayed behind after everyone else had gone home. The silence was deep and welcome. I was sitting on an overturned bucket, sketching out ideas for a menu on a notepad. Simple things. The dishes people had always loved. My braised short ribs, the mushroom risotto that took 40 minutes of constant stirring, the lemon tart with the impossibly thin crust. My food, my legacy. I looked up, out of our now spotless window. The lights were on across the street. It was 9 o'clock, a time when my restaurant used to have a waiting list. Now, it was half empty. I could see the few occupied tables scattered awkwardly around the room, islands of lonely diners in a sea of empty chairs. I could see the new staff, young and frantic, bumping into each other. I saw a waiter drop a tray of glasses, the sound too distant to hear, but the frantic, clumsy aftermath was painfully clear. Through the window, I saw Martin. He was standing near the bar, not talking to customers, just staring out into his empty domain. His shoulders were slumped. Sophie was next to him, her posture rigid, her face a mask of strained composure. She was talking at him, her hands making sharp, angry gestures. They were losing, and they knew it. I felt a pang in my chest, a sharp, bitter thing. It wasn't triumph. It was a profound and weary sadness. I was looking at my son, a boy I had raised to know better, and he was a stranger to me. He had traded a thriving, beloved institution for a failing, fashionable disaster. He had traded his mother's life's work for a plate of cold lamb with purple foam. I turned away from the window. I couldn't watch anymore. It felt like watching a slow, preventable car crash. I picked up my pen and focused on my list. The familiar names of the dishes were a comfort, an anchor. Cacio e pepe, pan-seared scallops, apple crumble. This was real. This was the future. The phone rang 2 days later. An unknown number. It was Sophie. Her voice was brittle, stripped of all its usual silky PR polish. "Laura," she said, without any preamble, "this has gone far enough. Martin is a wreck. You've made your point." I was silent. I was sanding a piece of reclaimed wood that would become part of our new counter. The rasp of the sandpaper against the grain was a soothing sound. "What do you want?" she snapped, her voice cracking with the strain. "Money? Do you want us to buy the name from you? Fine. Name your price." "It's not for sale, Sophie," I said calmly. "Then what is this? A vendetta? Are you really going to let the family business die just to spite your son?" "The family business," I replied, stopping my sanding, "died last week, on that stage. When you and Martin decided family was less important than a brand refresh, you didn't just replace a chef. You tried to erase a history, and you can't put a price on that. So you're just going to sit over there and watch us burn?" she asked, her voice rising to a desperate shriek. I thought of my son, his slumped shoulders in the empty restaurant. I thought of my team, laughing amidst the sawdust. I thought of the Fitzgeralds and their promise to be my first customers. "No, Sophie," I said, my voice soft but final. "I'm not going to watch you at all. I have work to do." I hung up the phone and went back to sanding my counter. The wood was old, but it was strong. Under my hands, it was becoming smooth, ready for a new life. The day before we opened was a symphony of controlled chaos. The air in our little bistro hummed with a nervous, joyful energy. It smelled of fresh paint, lemon polish, and the rich, promising aroma of the beef stock that had been simmering on the stove for 8 hours, the first thing I'd cooked in my new kitchen. The tables were set, the simple white cloths ironed to a perfect crispness. Julian was lovingly polishing every glass until it sparkled, arranging them on the new shelves behind the small, intimate bar. Maria was organizing the pantry, her labels handwritten in her neat, careful script. Everyone was moving with a sense of purpose, a quiet pride in what we had built with our own hands in just a few short weeks. Our new sign had been hung that morning. It was simple, painted in a deep, warm green on a piece of reclaimed wood. It said, "Laura's Real Kitchen." No fancy fonts, no corporate logos, just the truth. Every time I looked at it, I felt a deep, anchoring calm. This was mine. This was real. I was in the kitchen, tasting the stock, when Carlos poked his head through the doorway. His usual cheerful expression was gone, replaced by a look of concern. "Chef," he said quietly, "someone is here to see you." I knew who it was before he even said the name. I could feel it, a sudden chill in the warm, bustling room. "It's Martin." I wiped my hands on my apron. The clean, starched fabric, a familiar comfort. "It's okay, Carlos. Let him in." He walked in and stood awkwardly just inside the doorway, as if he were afraid to step further into our world. He looked diminished. The expensive suit he wore was rumpled, his hair was unkempt, and there were dark, hollowed-out circles under his eyes. He looked older, not in a mature way, but in a worn, frayed way. The swaggering confidence he'd had on that stage was gone, replaced by the stoop of a defeated man. He looked around the small dining room, his eyes taking in the simple wooden chairs, the fresh flowers on each table, the warm glow of the lights. He saw Julian, who gave him a brief, cold nod before turning his back to continue polishing a wine glass. The vibrant, happy energy of the room seemed to suck the air right out of him. "Mom," he began, his voice raspy. "Hello, Martin," I said. I didn't move towards him. I stayed on my side of the counter, in my kitchen. This was my ground. "The place looks nice," he said, the compliment sounding hollow and desperate. "We like it," I replied. "It's honest work." He flinched at the word, honest. He shuffled his feet, looking down at the newly polished floorboards. "Look," he said, finally raising his eyes to meet mine. They were his father's eyes, but today they were filled with a panic I had never seen before. "We need to talk. This has gone too far. The restaurant, it's empty." The new chef walked out yesterday, said the conditions were unworkable. "We're losing thousands of dollars a day. We're going to have to declare bankruptcy." He took a shaky breath. "I'm asking you, please, come back. We can fire Sophie's guy. We can undo everything. Just come back. Or at least Let us use the name again. We'll pay you a percentage of the profits. Anything. I listened. I listened to the desperation in his voice, to the litany of his failure. There was no apology in his words, no remorse for what he had done. Only the terror of losing his investment, his status. He was a drowning man, but he wasn't asking for a hand. He was trying to bargain for my life raft. When he finished, the silence in the room was heavy. I looked at my son, this stranger in a rumpled suit, and I felt a wave of profound, aching sorrow wash over me. I had won, but this victory felt like ashes in my mouth. I had saved my life's work, but I had lost my boy. Martin, I said, my voice steady, though my heart felt like a lead weight in my chest. You stood on a stage, and you told the world you were introducing the future of the kitchen. Well, here it is. I gestured with my hand, not just to the new stoves and shiny pots, but to the whole room, to Julian and Carlos and Maria, to the spirit of the place. This is the future, because it's built on the past. It's built on respect and hard work and love. I leaned forward slightly, my hands flat on the wooden counter that I had sanded myself. What you have over there, I said, nodding my head towards the street, is not the future. It's just what's left over when you throw the important things away. It's a collection of expensive chairs and empty tables. That's the past now, Martin, a failed experiment. His face crumpled. But it was our family's legacy. No, I cut him off, my voice sharp for the first time. It was my legacy, and you tried to sell it for a glossy magazine article and a trendy new menu. You wanted to be a modern restaurateur, but you forgot the first and only rule of this business, a rule that never gets old. People don't come back for the decor. They don't come back for the brand. They come back for food that has a soul, for a place that feels like home. You took the soul out of that restaurant, Martin, and I just followed it out the door. I picked up the spoon and took another taste of my stock. It was perfect, rich, deep, complex. It tasted of time and care. My name is not for sale, I said, finally. My kitchen is not for sale. My soul is not for sale. He just stood there, speechless. All the arguments Sophie had probably coached him on, all the business school tactics, they were useless here. This wasn't a negotiation. This was a statement of fact. Just then, the bell over the front door tinkled, and Mr. Blackwood, the critic, stepped inside. He was holding a small notebook and a pen. He beamed when he saw me, his eyes crinkling at the corners. He didn't seem to notice Martin at all, or if he did, he made a point of ignoring him. "Laura!" he boomed, his voice filling the room with a welcome warmth. "I was just passing by. The place looks magnificent, absolutely magnificent. There's a real buzz about tomorrow. The whole city is hungry." He walked right up to the counter and shook my hand firmly. "I'll be here, of course," he said, lowering his voice slightly but making sure Martin could hear every word. "And I'm bringing a few friends from the Chronicle, the Post, I think even a blogger from New York who's in town. Everyone has missed real food." He gave my hand a final, encouraging squeeze, then turned to leave. As he passed Martin, he gave him a brief, dismissive glance, a look one might give a piece of furniture that was in the way. That was the final blow, the confirmation from the world outside our little family drama that the verdict was in. The kingmaker himself had just anointed a new queen. Martin seemed to shrink. The last bit of fight went out of him. He looked at me one last time, his eyes pleading, but he knew there was nothing left to say. He turned and walked out the door, the little bell tinkling a sad, lonely goodbye. I watched him cross the street and disappear into the dark, empty husk of the restaurant that once bore my name. I felt Julian come to stand beside me at the counter. He placed a hand gently on my shoulder. "Are you all right, chef?" he asked. I took a deep breath. The air smelled of my stock. It smelled of my future. "Yes, Julian," I said, turning my back on the window and facing my new, beautiful kitchen. "I am." The victory was not triumphant. It was quiet. It was sad, but it was mine. And tomorrow, we would open the doors. Tomorrow, we would cook. The end had come. I woke up on opening day before the sun did. It's an old habit, a chef's internal clock that's been ticking for over 40 years. For a moment, lying there, in the pre-dawn quiet, I felt a familiar flicker of anxiety, the old pressure of running a big, important restaurant, the weight of expectations, the payroll, the bookings, the relentless pursuit of perfection. But then I opened my eyes, and the feeling was gone. It dissolved in the quiet morning light. Today was different. Today was not about pressure. It was about joy. When I arrived at the bistro, the sky was still a soft, pearly gray, but I wasn't the first one there. Julian was already outside, sweeping the sidewalk in front of our door, a small, dignified ritual. Maria was inside, humming to herself as she arranged bread in baskets on the counter. Carlos was in the back, sharpening my knives with the focus of a surgeon. We didn't speak much. We didn't need to. We were a well-oiled machine, each part moving in perfect sync, bound together by years of shared work and a fierce, unspoken loyalty. I walked into my new kitchen. It was small, compact, but it was mine. Everything was exactly where it should be. I had brought a few things from home, things that wouldn't have looked right in the sterile, industrial kitchen across the street. My grandmother's heavy cast-iron skillet, seasoned over a century of use. My collection of mismatched ceramic bowls, each with a chip or a crack that told a story. And my favorite, stockpot. It was an old, battered thing, dented and scorched on the bottom, the copper worn away in patches. A fancy young chef like Sophie's new hire would have thrown it out. But that pot held ghosts. It held the memory of every soup, every sauce, every stew I had ever perfected. It was the heart of my cooking. I tied on my apron, a simple, clean, white one, and I began to cook. I didn't think about reviews or critics or profits. I thought about the food. I thought about the buttery texture of slow-cooked onions, the sharp, clean scent of fresh parsley, the deep, satisfying richness of my short ribs braising in red wine. My hands moved with a muscle memory that was deeper than thought. This wasn't a job. It was who I was. And for the first time in years, I felt completely, utterly free. We opened our doors at noon. By 11:30, there was a line. It started with the Fitzgeralds, true to their word, standing at the front, bundled in their coats. Then more of my old regulars appeared. Then friends of regulars. Then strangers who had heard the buzz. The line snaked down the block, a cheerful, patient ribbon of people, all of them here for us. For me, Mr. Blackwood arrived, not with the quiet anonymity of a critic, but like a proud uncle, shaking hands, clapping people on the back, his booming voice full of cheer. The press was there, just as he'd promised, but they kept a respectful distance, their cameras capturing the scene, the palpable sense of a community coming together. I didn't stay hidden in the kitchen. I couldn't. Between orders, I'd walk out into the dining room, wiping my hands on my apron. The little room was packed, loud with the happy clatter of cutlery and conversation. People would see me, and their faces would light up. They would stand up to hug me, to shake my hand, to tell me how much they had missed my cooking. It wasn't just about the food. It was about connection. It was a reunion. At one point, I glanced out the big front window, and I saw them. Martin and Sophie were standing in the window of their restaurant across the street. The lights were off in their dining room. The temporary banner that said "The Kitchen" flapped mournfully in the breeze. They were just two silhouettes in a dark, empty space, watching a party they had not been invited to. They were watching their former customers, their former staff, their entire former life, celebrating without them. It was a slow, silent, public execution. I saw Sophie turn away from the window abruptly, her posture stiff with rage and humiliation. Martin lingered a moment longer. He just stood there, watching me. I couldn't read his expression from this distance, but I could feel the weight of his gaze. It was the look of a man who finally, irrevocably, understood the scale of his mistake. I turned away from the window. I had no joy in his pain. I had no time for it. My restaurant was full, and my people were hungry. The next day, Mr. Blackwood's review came out. It wasn't just a review. It was a proclamation. It was on the front page of the lifestyle section. The headline was simple: "The Queen is back on her throne, and her kingdom is more glorious than ever." He wrote about the food, of course, with his usual poetic flair. He described my risotto as a bowl of pure comfort that feels like a hug from the inside out, and my lemon tart as a sublime sliver of sunshine. But he did more than that. He told the whole story. He wrote about the award ceremony, the long years of service, the soulless ambition that had tried to cast aside a city's culinary icon. He didn't name Martin or Sophie, but he didn't have to. He painted a picture of authenticity versus artifice, of heart versus branding. He called my little bistro the defiant, beating heart of our city's food scene. And he ended the piece with a single, devastating line: "Some kitchens have a soul. Others are just rooms with expensive stoves." Last night, the entire city rediscovered the difference. That was the end of them. The review was the final nail. People didn't just stop going to the kitchen. They began to actively despise it. It became a symbol of betrayal. Within a month, a for-lease sign appeared in their window. Their grand future was over. My life, meanwhile, had just begun. The bistro was a runaway success. We had to start taking reservations weeks in advance. But I kept it small. I resisted the offers to expand, to franchise, to become a brand. I'd already learned that lesson. My joy was in the small things now. The camaraderie in the kitchen as we prepped for service, the look on a customer's face when they took their first bite, the quiet satisfaction at the end of a long night, sharing a glass of wine with Julian and the team. I wasn't a CEO anymore. I wasn't a brand. I was just Laura, a cook, standing in her kitchen, making food for people she cared about. One afternoon, a few months later, I was in the alley behind the bistro, tending to the small herb garden I had planted in wooden crates. I was snipping rosemary, its piney, sharp scent clinging to my fingers. I felt a presence behind me and turned. It was Martin. He looked different. The expensive suit was gone, replaced by simple jeans and a sweater. He had lost weight. He looked tired, but the frantic panic in his eyes was gone, replaced by a deep, hollowed-out sadness. He didn't speak for a long time. He just looked at my hands, at the shears, at the fragrant green sprigs of rosemary. I'm moving away," he finally said. "Sophie and we're done. She's going back to New York. I'm going to try my luck out west." "I see," I said softly. He kicked at a loose piece of gravel. "The bank took everything, the house, the car, everything." He looked up at me, and for the first time, I saw real remorse in his eyes. Not self-pity, remorse. "I was a fool, Mom," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I was an arrogant, blind fool. I had everything, and I threw it all away because I don't even know what I wanted. To be important, I guess." I stopped snipping the rosemary and just looked at my son. My heart ached for him, for the boy he had been, for the man he had failed to become. "What you wanted, Martin," I said, my voice gentle, "was the crown. You just didn't want the work that came with it. You wanted the applause, but you didn't respect the kitchen." He nodded, unable to speak. Tears were welling in his eyes. I took a deep breath. "I hope you find what you're looking for," I said, and I meant it. He stood there for another moment, then turned and walked away down the alley without another word. I didn't watch him go. I turned back to my herbs. I picked a sprig of thyme, crushed it between my fingers, and inhaled its earthy, resilient scent. It was the smell of something small and strong, something that grows in stony ground, something that endures. It was the smell of my new life. The Arstaments. A year is a long time. It's long enough for a wound to become a scar, and for a scar to fade into a pale, silvery line that you sometimes forget is even there. It's long enough for a small, struggling bistro to become the warm, beating heart of a neighborhood. Laura's real kitchen was no longer new. It was beloved. It had a rhythm. The same faces came on the same days. We knew who liked their coffee black and who needed extra bread for the sauce. The frantic energy of the opening months had settled into a deep, comfortable hum of a place that knows exactly what it is. My life had found its peace in that rhythm. The work was still hard, my feet still ached at the end of the night, but it was a good ache. It was the ache of creation, not the ache of conflict. We were closing up. It was a Tuesday, a cold, rainy night in late autumn. The last customers had trickled out, leaving behind the pleasant ghosts of their laughter and the scent of wine and good food. Julian was behind the bar, polishing the last of the glasses, his movements slow and methodical. The radio was playing some soft, instrumental jazz. Maria was at a corner table, quietly counting the day's earnings, her lips moving silently. It was a scene of domestic tranquility, the quiet winding down of a family at the end of a long day. A sharp knock on the glass door startled us. We all looked up. A figure was standing outside in the rain, a silhouette against the slick, dark street. Julian moved towards the door, ready to explain that we were closed, but I held up a hand. I recognized the stoop of those shoulders. I nodded to Julian. He unlocked the door. Martin stepped inside, bringing a gust of cold, damp air with him. He looked like a stray who had been out in the weather too long. A year had carved new lines on his face. He was thinner, and the expensive haircut was gone, replaced by something simpler, a little shaggy. He wore a plain wool coat, and he clutched the lapels as if he were holding himself together. The arrogance was gone. The anger was gone. All that was left was a deep, settled weariness. The easy atmosphere in the room evaporated. Julian stood by the bar, his posture stiffening, his expression unreadable but protective. Maria stopped counting, her head bowed over the table. They were my silent guards, my loyal court, and this was an intruder from a past we had all left behind. Martin's eyes met mine. He didn't look around the room, didn't acknowledge the success that surrounded him. He seemed to have no space for anything but the single, difficult purpose that had brought him here. "Mom," he said. His voice was quiet, stripped of all its former bluster. It was just a voice. The voice of the boy I remembered. I waited. I'm living in a small apartment now, on the other side of town," he began, as if he needed to establish his new, smaller place in the world. "I'm working in a bookstore. It's quiet." He looked down at his damp shoes. "I'm trying to cook for myself. Just simple things." He took a shaky breath. "The other night, I wasn't feeling well, and I remembered that soup you used to make for me when I was a kid, the one with the tiny little pasta stars. The chicken soup you always made when I had a fever." He finally looked up at me, and his eyes were raw with a vulnerability I hadn't seen since he was 10 years old and had fallen out of the old oak tree in our backyard. "I can't get it right," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "The broth is always cloudy. It doesn't taste the same. It doesn't taste like home." He paused, the words hanging in the air between us, heavy with all the things he wasn't saying. "I was wondering, would you write down the recipe for me?" The request was so simple, so small, and yet it was the biggest thing he could have possibly asked for. He wasn't asking for money. He wasn't asking for the business. He wasn't even asking for forgiveness. He was asking for a memory, a single, pure thing from a time before ambition had poisoned everything. I looked at him, my son, and the last hard knot of anger in my heart finally, gently dissolved. It wasn't forgiveness. Forgiveness is a conscious act, a decision. This was something different. It was a quiet, sorrowful understanding. It was the recognition that he was finally beginning to understand the true nature of what he had lost. It wasn't a restaurant. It was the taste of his mother's soup. As I stood there, lost in thought, Julian moved silently. He took 2 clean glasses from the shelf and filled them with water from the pitcher on the bar. He walked over and placed one on the table in front of Martin and the other on the counter in front of me. It was a simple, compassionate gesture, an offering of peace. Then, just as silently, he caught Maria's eye. They gathered their things and slipped out the back door, leaving the 2 of us alone in the quiet, lamplit room. I turned without a word and walked back into my kitchen. I tore a clean sheet from the order pad and picked up a pen. The pen felt steady in my hand. I started to write. 1 whole chicken, good quality. 2 carrots, roughly chopped. 2 celery stalks, roughly chopped. 1 onion, peeled and halved. A bay leaf. A few peppercorns. I wrote down the simple, honest ingredients. I detailed the instructions: how to cover it with cold water, how to bring it slowly to a simmer, how to skim the top diligently to keep the broth clear. As I wrote, I could almost feel the phantom warmth of that long-ago kitchen, hear the sound of his small, congested coughs from the other room. I paused before the last line. Then I added the most important part. And the most important thing, Martin: cook with patience. The soup needs time. Don't rush it. Don't ever rush it. I walked back out and held the piece of paper out to him. He took it from my hand, his fingers brushing against mine. The paper was flimsy, a stark contrast to the thick, legally binding documents that had once passed between us. He read it, his eyes moving slowly over my familiar handwriting. He lingered on the last line. A single tear tracked its way down his cheek and fell onto the paper, making a small, blurry starburst on the ink. He folded it carefully, reverently, and tucked it into his coat pocket as if it were a winning lottery ticket. "Thank you," he whispered. He turned and walked to the door. He didn't look back. I listened as his footsteps faded away into the sound of the rain. I stood there for a long time in the quiet of my beautiful, peaceful restaurant. The war was over. The victory had been won long ago. But this felt like peace. He had tried to take my name, my business, my legacy, all the big, important things. He thought the power was in the sign above the door. And after all the battles, all the heartbreak, all the failure, he had come back as a beggar, asking only for a recipe. He finally understood that the real legacy was never in the name. It was in the hands that made the food. I looked at the piece of paper in his pocket, now walking away into the night. My last lesson, my true inheritance. Maybe someday, I thought, as I turned to switch off the last light. Maybe someday he'll learn, not just how to cook, but how to remember.